liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, everyone. Please be seated. Jenna, could we have roll call, please?
Trustee Gergen. Here. Trustee Rhodey.
Here.
Trustee Belt. Here. Trustee Krasovich. Here. Trustee Kreiser. Here. Trustee Grabowski.
Here.
President Knutson.
Here. Item 2, old business, continued hearing on an appeal of the 2023 fire EMS protection fee filed by Cecilia Senior Homes LLC regarding real property located at 1061 Cecilia Drive and having tax ID number PWV 0902-996-008 and possible action thereon. Again, I remind you, we can only discuss what is written here. Do not go into anything further as it relates to anything else that you may want to talk about, but we cannot. It's just about this. And I'll hand it over to Matt.
Yeah, so just to set the table a little more, Jeff. So this is a continuation of a hearing that was first held before the board on May 21st of this year. At that time, the board conducted certain fact-finding activities, heard presentations from the appellants by counsel, Ms. Summers. Also heard a presentation from the then village administrator, Scott Gussie, and further presentation from the consultant with Baker Tilly, Mr. Matt Stark. After taking those facts and information and comments, which were part of the record and are part of the entire record on this hearing, and I would just state for the record that all of that was live streamed and available on the village websites. The video of that hearing is there as well. But after that initial fact finding, the board did make a motion to adjourn and table the item pending receipt of further information, specific information from the consultant from Baker Tilly. He has prepared that information, provided that in a memorandum, which is part of the board's packet this evening. And I think in terms of the order of things tonight, I would ask Mr. Stark to come up and make a presentation orally to add and supplement anything that he would like to the memorandum, respond to any questions the board may have at this time, and then in all fairness, give Ms. Summers an opportunity to provide any sort of response based on Mr. Stark's supplemental information. So,
thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Islam?
Doesn't seem like it is.
You agree, my husband?
No.
All right.
All right.
uh-oh.
We have a glitch.
Talk loud.
Let's try to fix it first.
All right.
I trust your voice is loud enough. But.
All right. Try this again. All right, thank you to the village board for having me. I don't have a lot in way of presentation on top of what's in the memo itself. Essentially, in response to questions from the village board, I did a quick recalculation of the care home and senior living parcels to basically, if we separated those, what would the impact be? The bottom line from the end of the memo is that the care home category was generating the equivalent of 6.34 ESCs, and the senior living category was generating about half of that at 3.16. I believe that was the only question that had come to me in terms of the response that was needed, but I'm happy to take any other questions about the memo if there's anything that's unclear.
Any questions from the board for Mr. Stark as to the information in the memo at this point?
So there were some that were misclassified. Is that the case, or can you discuss that a little bit?
I don't know if any that were misclassified here.
Okay. In the
Last year-
spreadsheet?
I'd have to look at which spreadsheet you're talking about. Is that the calls, I'm sorry, the incident?
Yeah, the allocation spreadsheet from the original one. Were there any that were miscalculated with some discrepancies?
I mean, the only error that I know of that was in the spreadsheets related to the multifamily units that we discussed last year, where we had housing units that were not populated in the spreadsheet, so they didn't get picked up on first pass. That was in a memo that I sent, I think it was November of last year.
Yeah, and that all was fixed, and we haven't had any other issues
Right, I mean,
in
that
there.
was
Okay.
just a missing data.
Yeah.
In terms of misclassified properties, I mean, we had assigned properties to different classes for the analysis. I don't know that I changed any of those.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions from the board? All right.
Thank you very much.
Attorney Summers, if you have anything else you'd like to respond to?
Only 5 feet tall. I always wanted to be taller, but I don't think that's in my future. Okay, is that about work or?
Yes.
Yeah.
Works great.
Okay. As this is a continuation of the prior hearing, I understand it's all included. I'm not going to make my arguments. I know the purpose here generally to talk about whether these are fair and reasonable. Of course, from the prior hearing, our position is that these are not permitted under Wisconsin law to be separately imposed in addition to the property tax. I'm not going to reiterate all that today because it's part of the record, and that may be outside of what the board's purpose is at least at the time. I do want to make a couple of additional points and also respond to the most recent report and address the data that's in there. One of the things when we look back at kind of the original methodology, because I think the question and the concern is when you look at if you have a separate special fee, we want it to be fair and reasonable. So part of that is making sure the methodology ensures that is the ultimate result. When we look at the costs in the original Baker Tilly report, most of the costs are for emergency medical services. The report identifies 2,211 calls for EMS and fire calls of 374. So most of the calls are EMS calls. I would generally anticipate, I don't know, not having a breakdown of the cost, but I would generally anticipate that any costs associated with the fire services, including fixed asset costs and specific if there is an actual fire, would be higher than the EMS. I think as a result, it would be reasonable to separate out fire from EMS, do the separate allocation, because I think that the fire costs would indeed exceed those associated with the EMS services. We don't have that data. It might be helpful to have that data, or at least be able to inform us, is that in fact the case, and does not breaking it out result in assessments that are not fair and reasonable. That's the concern there. Also, the total calls used in kind of the denominator of the calculation, 2,330, do not include 255 calls that are not linked to specific addresses. I think the thought process, it appears from the report, was that there wasn't a methodology to assign those particular calls to specific addresses to pass along those costs. But nonetheless, those were actual calls within the village. It would seem that those calls shouldn't be shifted to taxpayers in terms of the burden and of the expense associated with that. So I'm going to give you a calculation a little bit later. And what I did was I took that 2,330, I added the 255 calls not linked to specific addresses, and that gets us to 2,585 calls. For Cecilia Place in particular, the property we're looking at here today, if you look at the detail, I have some of the spreadsheets, which it sounds like maybe one of the village trustees was looking at. Mine kind of look like this. I don't know if you got yours in blue or not. But I can hand out some additional copies of that, if it would be helpful. Can I just hand out some?
Sure. If you have enough for the whole board, that would be fine.
I think I might have 8 additional ones. Just have to do it.
That should be sufficient.
And I'll give you the hat. Take one and pass it down. Thank you so much. So what the pages, I think there are 4 pages total. There's a bigger spreadsheet that had all of the properties within the municipality for the 2020 to 2022 time period. So that is 3 years. I printed the sheet that had 1061 Cecilia Drive, which is the subject property. So you'll see the first call is a little more than halfway down, continues on to the next couple of pages, and then on the, it's only a couple of entries on the plan sheet. Just to orient yourself as to what it is that you have in front of you. If you were to look at that detail, roughly that 3.5 pages, again, that shows that really all the calls to Cecilia Place were EMS calls and not fire. So that's an additional reason why it might be informative or helpful to say what are the costs for just EMS versus fire, to be able to make sure that any imposition of an additional charge is in fact fair and reasonable. In addition, when you look at the detail here, there were certain calls that were alarm system activation, no fire, unintentional, and similar calls like that. When I take those out, I think the Baker Tilly report concludes that Cecilia Place for that 3-year period had 85 calls. My calculation is 76 calls. So there does seem to be discrepancy between the numbers in the Baker Tilly report versus the detail when I reviewed it here. If we, at the most, if you took the 76 calls out of that updated 2,585 calls, when you count those 255 calls not linked to a specific address, and you look at that cost in the report of $1,768,446, at a minimum, if you did the analysis on that methodology, is that here are the actual costs. This is the usage that would result in an adjusted fire and EMS fee of $51,900. So we're going to keep going from here, but at a minimum, we are asking that the fee be adjusted down based on usage, because again, that's what the data was based on, which would bring us down to $51,993. When you look at the usage, what is striking is that Cecilia Place had essentially the same number of total calls as Hawthorne. So with my adjusted numbers, we have 76, Hawthorne had 81. So if Hawthorne was assessed one ESC, it would be fair and reasonable that Cecilia Place should have that same ESC category. Because ultimately, when that analysis was done, it was based on usage, and we have essentially identical usage. Another concern is that the data is from a limited time period, 2020 to 2022. It was a 3-year period. It was also the height of COVID. I think at the last hearing, the board was provided, I believe, this sheet. I can provide additional copies as well. Want to provide it again?
Did the board receive it at the last hearing? I'm sorry.
I think you guys did, but why don't I just hand it on? That way.
If you have copies, that's fine.
I can feel bad. Thank you. Pass it down, so give them mine's approaching, we'll just, I'll
fine.
get
Thank
one
you.
to everyone. You're very welcome. Thank you. So, I have done the math for you guys, but so the data you have in front of you is from a longer time span. I think it's important to get a broader picture, because if the data is available, I think we really need to say, hey, is that 2020 through 2022 time period representative? Or might it not in fact be representative if you look at the overall time span? So if you look at the 9 years that are included on that sheet, which is information we received from the village of Pewaukee, you will see that Cecilia Place, if you add it all up, you have 171 total calls for that 9-year period, or on average 19 calls per year. In contrast, Hawthorne had more. They had 204 total calls on average, nearly 23 calls per year. So whether you're looking at the calls for the 3-year period, 2020 to 2022, or that larger 9-year period that I just provided you guys, I think you had before, what is again striking and important to note is that we had essentially the same or somewhat significantly less total calls than Hawthorne. At the last village board meeting, a motion was made and passed that Hawthorne should be reduced to 1 ESC. Given the identical position or even a few less usage, we would request that we also be put in that 1 ESC category. Any questions from the village?
So you would want us to equate your property with Hawthorne Place, but Hawthorne Place has 104 units compared to yours, which is about half as many with the same amount of calls.
Correct. We have the same usage, so when we look at the number of calls, I think the methodology ultimately can be done in any number of ways. The beginning part of the Baker Tilly methodology did analysis based on the number of calls and then applied it to certain categories, and then we took that dollar amount and divided it up by number of units. So I think it's a little bit of apples to oranges in terms of a different methodology. While Hawthorne does have more units than Cecilia Place, I think the important aspect is they have the same or even more calls. So I think
They have the same or even more calls, but they have almost twice the number of units as yours.
They do, but it's the same number. So when you look at usage, I think what is the confusing part of it is the calculation using the number of units. If I were to do the calculation, and you can also look at the fact that a census changes in the different properties. Some of these properties sometimes might have full occupancy or more full occupancy. Other times they might have less occupancy. What we also don't know when you look at whether it's a 2020 through 2022 time period, or the additional how many units were occupied. So I think using a methodology that's a per unit computation, I think can lead to unfair and unreasonable results, because you may not have the full census versus in other times you may be more occupied, other times you may be less occupied. I think what should have been done is you should have just taken the number of calls, divided by the total calls, and then look at the cost and say, this particular property, because it's a single tax key number, regardless of the number of units, it's a single tax key number, what was assessed, the EMS and fire charge, say that would be the right result, to take the number of calls divided by the total times the cost, and that's what gets imposed against the particular property.
You don't.
Okay, but can I ask us?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, I was just gonna, real quick, you don't find that your methodology there is gonna create a bigger Pandora's box, for instance, let's say if you're going off of not census numbers, but since you're saying ours is flawed with number of units, I am the only one up here that is a solo resident within their household. I pay the same as everyone else, so shouldn't I be on your side then fighting because my numbers don't pan out the same as everyone else?
Well, I think if you.
Because we're counting them per household.
Right. But even that illustrates, like, your household, I'm not sure how many people are in your household.
I said one, so I'm the only one that has a solo residence up here, I believe so. If I'm not misspoken, but I think everyone else up here has multiple,
We want to include your pets, right?
yeah, correct.
So,
We have to look for her one.
Yeah, so it's, if we're going off of that, where you're saying, we shouldn't count it as units, we should count, because sometimes, a unit is vacant, sometimes it's more. I mean, there's not a single methodology that we could come up with then if we're going off of census numbers, because that would be impossible even for single family residents to figure out.
and the comment about census was not to say we should use the census numbers, the comment was to illustrate that when you're looking at a per unit calculation, that doesn't take into account the fact that some of the units may be occupied, some may not. And to your point, it illustrates that point as well, that you have variations in households, whether you're a one-person household or a 6 or 10-person household. So by using a methodology that just looks at the number of calls for that particular property divided by the total number of calls times the cost, that would account for if you're one person and you need one call, if you're a 6-person household and you 6 calls, you have higher usage.
So, but you're saying to break that down by individual tax codes then after that? Or are we still including it as single-family homes, multi-unit developments, senior care, things like that?
I would say you would do it not necessarily in the categories of single-family homes, multi-family homes. I think by lumping those categories together, because if you look at even the supplemental Lake utility data, you'll see there are variations in the care homes, so the 4 properties in that classification. There are significant variations between them. When you look at the number of units and the number of calls, it is wildly different. So by saying we're going to lump it all together, come up with a per classification amount, and apply it by units, we're in essence, we have fewer calls than, I think it was report, I can't remember exactly, but in essence, putting all of us together in a single classification means that we are paying more because others in our same category have a higher usage. So I would actually do away with the categories and just say on a per parcel basis. You look at the data and you say, what is that property's usage? Because that was essentially the methodology to get to, hey, this is how we're going to come up with an ESC amount. And I think actual usage is more reflective of what we were trying to get to, which was we have a cost, we're going to look at usage to determine how to allocate it. But then I think we kind of went off track a little bit when then it started with that, but then came up with a category and per category ESC amount. So presumably you'd have fewer fire and EMS services, you'd have fewer costs or lesser costs.
Yeah, I'd still come back to, and I don't want to say there's always going to be some discrepancies, or there's always going to be someone that feels they get the short end of the stick there, but even if you base it off of number of calls per tax codes of single-family residents, the fact that my single occupied 1,200 square foot house is paying the same as a family of 8 in a 7,000 square foot house, or no, we don't have 7,000 on the side, but let's say a 3,000 square foot house on the lake, someone's going to get the short end of the stick there. I mean, until you're breaking it down per census, like you originally said, but then the variations that occur on a weekly basis at a senior living center would not even make that feasible, so.
Again, I didn't mean to give the impression we do it on a census basis, but I was just using that to illustrate that by saying using units skews the result when those units can have different census numbers.
Right, and what I was getting at is using the unit is the only way to basically take any, I don't want to say gray area out of it, but when you want it, but what it does is create some, variations in how you say, fair and equitable.
I think that my argument and position is that it would be more, we have data, and we know in each, there are only a handful of categories or a handful of properties in each of the categories that we're talking about here, like their home and senior living. So at a minimum, for those categories, we know the different numbers. So to say, we're gonna lump you all together, come up with a number, and that's what we're gonna apply. I think putting aside the argument, but of course, in any given situation, someone's gonna argue it's not as fair and reasonable as it could be. But if you have that data, I don't think we should be penalized for having fewer calls, for example, than other, even if we did the analysis on a per unit basis as other calls. So at a minimum, I would say we should look at our actual calls divided by the total calls times the cost, and our number should be reduced to about, roughly, my number is 52,000, when I do the actual math. If that alone shows, if my calculation is that different from this roughly 65,000, is it really fair and reasonable to be overcharging us by 13,000? We have the data, it's not that we don't.
So looking at it from your methodology, though, wouldn't that fluctuate year to year? How much data are you looking? Are we looking at a 10-year time frame, 5-year, 3-year? Because in a care facility, you could have higher need patients at a different point in time. And as you said, you might have many vacant units. Well, that's not, as a village, that's not our responsibility to bear, you guys not being able to fill your units, just like others up here who have rental properties, regardless if they have a tenant in that property, they're still going to pay this fee. So it gets dicey when you look at it that way. I see where you're coming from, but then it's going to be this constant fluctuation where one year maybe you're going to pay $45,000 in the fee, the next year you're going to pay $65,000 because the data is going to be fluctuating so much. I mean, is that what you're looking at? Is that then you would be looking? If you look at just straight usage, and to Jim's point, there is no perfect calculation, and I'm not saying that we did a phenomenal job on that. It's just, there is still lots to learn, and we have the data, but it's just never going to be a perfect system. If we fix it here, I mean, I don't want to say fix it. If we lower it here, the money still has to come from somewhere within the village. So trying to come up with something that, this was a calculation with a methodology we felt was fair, and so, but when we look at that full usage, I don't understand your thought process of throwing vacant units in there and having to decrease, that your fee should be decreased because you have vacant units because your usage is less. Well, again, that, to me, that's not our problem.
I would also suggest that those differences in some cases are going to be random. I mean, is the difference that you live at Cecilia Place and that's why there's lower usage?
Well, the other.
What makes that audience arguably different than the audience at Hawthorne?
I mean, the other part to
They're a
piggy,
consistent category, and that's why they were included in the same group.
I just want to give Ms. Summers, there's a lot of comments, and some can be
Yeah, sorry.
construed
And
as questions, so I want to give her an opportunity to respond. So before, Jim, you make a comment.
I was just gonna agree with
So
trustee.
obviously, a lot was said there, but feel free to respond as you choose.
Thank you. I will do my best to respond. So, so to the first comment about how do you do it, the methodology, will it go up and down? You know, I think oftentimes when you have these charges, and you indeed, I think there was in the ordinance, it anticipates potentially revisiting, doing a recalculation, I can't recall if it's in 2026 or sooner, or I think is the opportunity to do it at any point where the village board thinks that it would be appropriate to do so. My numbers were looking at consistent with the Baker Tilly report of 2020 to 2022. So that would be looking at a 3-year total, and you know that might be reasonable. Using a 3-year total, having that in place. Sometimes we have certain agreements with municipalities where we look at this. If you look at the actual data, does it go up by more than X percent or down by more than Y%? And if so, you adjust. Otherwise, you don't. So I can understand it could add some administrative, cumbersome nature if you were to do it on an annual basis. But certainly, a couple-year basis, I think would not be unreasonable. And I think if what you're trying to measure is burden of sharing a portion of the cost based on usage, I do think it may need to fluctuate up and down. I mean, because if your usage goes way up, maybe you're just lucky and the village says, I'm sorry, okay,
I was just, so to kind of piggyback off of Trustee Belt's, the concern with, the methodology of usage or occupancy, when you look at it of when these fees are applied, be it your tax bill. So let's say, hypothetically speaking, Cecilia's at full occupancy of 57 units. They have a bad virus go through the facility. They have a massive amount of calls during that year. So the next year, let's say some of those residents have moved on to one place or another. So now there's 40 residents in the following year. We sat here for not only the last meeting, the meeting before, the special meeting before that, getting it put into very clearly into our heads that fixed incomes are tough. So now we're saying we've provided a fixed amount that we are charging, and you're saying to go ahead and throw that out to where 1 year it could be 2-3 times what it was, and the residents that are still there are now carrying the burden of the residents that are no longer at that facility from the year prior. And you're saying that's a fair methodology.
I am saying it is a fair methodology because it's based on usage. And that, to Trustee Bell's point, to your point, that is why you could use a couple-year look to kind of have a stabilized methodology. Undoubtedly, there's a concern where the residents are on fixed incomes and the costs are of concern. But look at the fact that, for example, if right now, the 2023 on the tax bill beyond was 65,000, they weren't anticipating that. I mean, if we go down to even using the actual numbers, and I did not intend to, move everyone in terms of thinking of census or units. My point was just that there can't be.
No, we're talking methodology in dollars. That's what we're.
So because of all of those discrepancies and all those variations, that's why I think just sticking with the amount of calls divided by the total calls times the cost, that results in the most accurate allocation based on usage of the actual cost.
But I'm saying that'll be applied to the next calendar year when that resident that may have, residents, plural, that may have been responsible for a bulk of those calls may not be there to carry that burden. So now we're going to sit here with a room full of people going, rather than a $1,200 charge that they were not anticipating this year, now it's a $2,400 charge, and they weren't anticipating that year. So now we're snowballing this because, like I said, there's always going to be a 1 year lag from when the fee gets applied to the residents who may or may not have created that usage?
You know, that's no different than what the village has done here today. Because when you look at the 2020 through 2022 data, and that was the basis for the village's methodology in applying that to come up with a value or a specific charge amount on the 2023 tax bill, those residents that result in emergency calls in 2020, 21, and 22, to your point, they may move on. So that's.
What I'm saying is that's flat, though.
That's flat for this year. That's flat for 2023, but your point is, well, those residents that calls or that result in emergency calls, by the time that number is imposed on the tax bill, they may move down. That's the exact same thing with the 2020 through 2022 data. I mean, it just flows forward. If you're using data to look at emergency calls, whether what they really did in their report for 2020 through 2022, or my proposal of you look at a couple year time span, as they did, and just that data will always be somewhat historical. So it will always, there may be residents that have moved on, and to your point, maybe goes up, maybe goes down. It could go both ways. Absolutely. But if what the village is trying to do is have a very reasonable allocation based on usage, I think if we have the actual data, we should adjust versus the place based on where actual data is available. You know, there are a variety of questions or comments. I'm not sure if I responded to all of them as part of the back and forth, but.
You didn't address mine.
Okay, I'm sorry, could you please?
Yeah, absolutely. So my comment was related to the fact that you're looking at Cecilia Place as its own specific unit. What differentiates it from Hawthorne?
So that's part of my point is really there's nothing that differentiates it when.
I think that's my point, actually, but
Okay.
by all means, make it for me. That'd be great.
They were on the same page. That would be great. So my point is that you look at the number of calls and actual usage of the really just EMS services, although the lumping in fire and EMS. And when you do that, they are in fact nearly identical for the 2020 to 2022 time period. And when you look at that even broader time period, Cecilia Place actually had fewer calls in aggregate than Hawthorne. So I would say they are no different. And that's why my position is, since the village board said for Hawthorne, we are reducing it, the fire EMS charge fee, same issue.
So what is the categorical difference as it pertains to lower usage at Cecilia is actually my more specific question.
Yes, I'm not understanding your question.
So you're saying that Cecilia should be looked at independently because they have a lower usage rate. So can you explain to me the category that would apply to this specific unit? Because I'm confused as to what is the explanation for that dramatically lower usage rate? Or is it really, if we did this on a per average basis, per unit, per resident, we'd find that those numbers are a lot closer than you imagine?
Yeah, and I don't know if we have some representatives from Cecilia Place that may be able to explain, but one point is that they do have additional care and services at Cecilia Place. So for example, I think if a resident has a concern about do they need to call EMS, I think there are staff on site that can evaluate and say, you know, let's give my details, might not be right, but let's take your vital. Let's take a glass of water. Let's revisit that to say, do you really need to make that fire EMS call or do you not? I'm not sure that that same system is in place for other facilities. So I think that is why the calls are somewhat significantly reduced for Cecilia because they have that general filter there.
Thank you.
Do the assessment.
Thank you. One follow-up question, since you brought up the tendency or likelihood that residents would be making a call, do you have any concern that looking at things in such a granular fashion, basing the fee on actual usage, would actually prohibit or make it less likely that people in need of emergency services would call, knowing that they would perhaps experience a negative financial ramification?
Yeah, I don't think so. I suppose that, you know, anything is possible, of course, but I think if someone is in need of EMS services, if they think there's something, a heart attack or a stroke or something, they're gonna call. I mean, I think they will call for services if they
Great.
need them.
If you'll indulge me with one more follow-up. You determined that fire calls were likely to be less expensive?
No, I thought potentially more expensive.
Oh, more expensive. So like cat in a tree, is that a fire call or an EMS call? or-
Isn't fire dispatched with EMS calls anyways?
Perhaps you don't know.
Yeah.
It's multiple vehicles that go out on emergency
Gotcha.
calls.
Yeah.
All of the personnel in the Pewaukee Fire Department, 100% of them are paramedics. So you often have not only an ambulance, but you also have a fire truck that also has paramedics going out at the same time.
Okay.
And even with that, I think, oh, I apologize.
No, go ahead, finish up and then I'll make my statement.
I love the interactive discussion. This is, I appreciate the opportunity to be before the board to answer these questions and have this discussion. To Trustee Rody's point, I mean, even if you have both fire trucks that go out with EMS calls and perhaps vice versa, if you have fire calls, that you might have an EMS vehicle, personnel that go along as well. If I'm presuming that if in fact there's no actual fire, then when we look at the costs associated with that overall call versus, let's say you do have a fire, so that 300 or so, 2 fire calls during that 3-year span, those costs are going to be dramatically more if you have the actual. I would think, but we don't have that data.
No data.
Right.
Yeah, I
That's
don't,
tricky.
Right, I know, but that's just my point, is, it seems to me that there is a difference between the two types of calls.
I think it's accurate as far as the length of time that the fire department would be on hand for a fire versus an emergency. You're correct there. But as far as the amount of equipment use and personnel, they're probably a lot closer in cost overall.
I would venture
Okay.
that, oh yeah, sorry.
My statement is that many years ago, when I was on the board, we had a methodology for charging fire EMS. EMS was a little less expensive, fire was considerably more. As to the point of will people be concerned about calling EMS? Yes, during that period of time, because the fire trucks came with the EMS people, there were a lot of elderly citizens and some middle-aged, okay, that when they saw that the fire truck was showing up, would not call when they had an EMS emergency, or were hesitant because they knew, oh my God, the truck is coming, I'm going to get hit with the bigger charge. So that is one thing. The other thing is that when the fire trucks did show up for a false alarm or any type of situation where they were called because a fire alarm went off, they were charged the normal rate of a fire call. And there were a lot of places that were coming up with some hefty bills on that. So that's why we went away from that, due to the fact that we were concerned that people that needed EMS were not calling. So that is why this method, after years of not having something, this came into being, and it seemed to be the most fair, because it does kind of put the burden, not burden, but it does put the costs where the costs are.
Which is my point in terms of using our actual data for our property. Time will tell perhaps, but if with village residents understanding that this methodology still takes into account the number of calls, whether it's, total fire EMS, whether you separate it out between the 2 categories, I think that there's still a likelihood that if using the past methodology, village residents were concerned and might not call in certain situations. This a different, but still the same basis of number of calls is used here. So it might have the same effect on some village residents who have that part. But I'm not sure it's all that different.
No question. If we're going off of the methodology of usage within the category, do we have the data to say what the number of calls were for single-family residents? Because I'm willing to bet there's not one call per household in the village.
I was just gonna.
So does that mean would you want us to then go back, rethink this to where maybe single-family homes are 0.25 ESEs because that's the amount of calls that they generated, and then we use Cecilia Place, for example, at 1 or 1.25, but they're carrying, it's still the same pie that we have to consume, but now if we're going off of the methodology of actual usage numbers, maybe single-family homes shouldn't be a 1, maybe they should be below that. And then, but we still have to consume that whole pie, so your number doesn't change.
I,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead, if you want to.
I'm happy to respond to each comment just to make sure we kind of have the record as clear as possible. I mean, I'm assuming Baker Tilly has the data for the single family home, so I don't know on a per single family or multi-family home basis how those numbers would shake out. But I think it could be fairly reasonable to say, yeah, you do it even if you apply it for us, you apply for them, although again, we're the only ones here. So, you know,
Oh, I'll appeal as a single family
Yeah.
homeowner. I'm definitely at 0.
I mean, I
I'm
think
submitting my
the,
paperwork when we get done with this, so.
I think the purpose of just looking at just your usage like that does open to where we would then be looking at every single person's usage, right? And I've lived in the village for 15 years and I've called EMS, I think, once because I thought someone was in my house and I was scared. But that was in 15 years, you know, and I think if we're, to Jim's point, if we are going to start looking at it by usage, it could not, to be fair and just, be just looked at for usage for you. It would have to be looked at across the board for everybody, and that number truly could be more expensive. And to Jeff's point, if we went back to, okay, well then just pay, and what is our amount that's charged for using the actual services? If we're presuming things, I would presume it's a lot higher than $65,000 in the year if we were actually just charging per call and service per location. So, you know, I wasn't on the board when this was implemented, but I know that everyone like really tried to come up with something that did make sense for the village and did try to use the data and the usage that was presented to make it a fair situation for everybody. And I just wanted to say that.
yeah. No, and we appreciate all of the villages that we do. Not having the specific data, I don't know how the numbers would shake out. But what I do know is when you look at our actual data and compare it to those, even within that care home category, we have significantly less usage. I think that's an important consideration. And I understand the whole concern about Pandora's box and slippery slope, but we're here appealing, and I think we have to determine, is it fair and reasonable when you look at our assessment and our imposition fees? I don't think we can necessarily say, well, you know, you can see how, you know, the numbers might be too high, but we're not going to do it because under different calculation or done under a different approach, it might still be that high or might be higher. I mean, we're looking at the actual data we have from the Baker Tilly report and that specific underlying data to show that our numbers, if you look at the actual usage, we are being overcharged. That is not fair and reasonable. And when you look at our usage versus Hawthorne, we have identical, if not less usage. And if they is significantly lower imposition, I don't see how that's fair and reasonable.
And can you remind me again where you got your 51,000 number from? Was that just straight usage?
Yes.
Okay.
So that was taking the 76 total calls during the 3-year period, dividing it by 2,585 calls, and multiplying it by the total cost from the village report of 1,768,446.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
But again, to the points being made up here, then I'll go using your methodology, I should get billed 0, because I don't use fire and EMS. I also shouldn't pay for the school system because my daughter goes to a private school. Where does it end? I mean, these are the battles that we up here as trustees have to take into consideration, and part of being part of part of being part of a community is bearing these financial burdens, unfortunately. I bear financial burdens for the village and the county and the state for services that I don't use either. So,
And, yeah, no, fair points, but to answer those points, if I may, that's why you have property taxes. The property taxes cover things like schools, libraries, other costs, some of which people may use, some of which they may not. But that's the idea behind general property taxes that cover the village's burden. So under my approach, yes, perhaps you should have zero additional fee on your property tax bill for fire and EMS charges.
but fire and EMS was removed off of your property taxes already
Right.
because we implemented this fee as opposed to going another route to trying to fund this, which
And
regardless, we have to fund it.
And I think it should be in the property taxes. Notably, if I look at the village's illustrations for the average single-family home, I think it showed a net reduction. That's significantly different than here where we're talking about, I think it nearly doubled the property tax bill.
And would the residents at Cecile Place have approved a referendum to increase our property tax levy?
I don't know. I mean, if they
So
were-
but these are the things people need to think about. Like we have to pull, the money has to come from somewhere. We can't cut fire and EMS services. So one way or another, if we would have pushed out a referendum, we would have also had people in here complaining about voting no on a referendum, and we might have been right back in the same situation. Whether it's property taxes, as you say, is fair that everyone pays versus a fee, it doesn't matter. It's still the same amount of money regardless of which pie it's coming out of. It's still so.
But it's not the same amount of money when you look at the Cecilia Place and you look at the additional charge versus historical. That's part of the point. It's not the same. It's dramatically more. So, whereas again, perhaps for your property tax bill, for all your individual property tax bills, perhaps they went down when you changed the methodology, but not so for Cecilia Place.
But you're talking, but
So I just want to, hold on, I just want to jump in.
I
Yeah.
just have one question.
I just want to jump in here, just to, okay. So I want you to have the opportunity to provide information to the board, right? And you're doing that fine, okay? But what I don't want this to turn into is a call and response where we make a comment and then force her to respond. If there's certain information you would like her to provide to the board, please put that in the form of a question, and let's do it that way, please.
that's fair. What I was going to say was that I think never mind, I just lost it. Thanks, Matt. I'm just kidding.
I'm sorry, Ms. Kreiser.
I'm
No,
just-
that train of thought,
Totally kidding.
Yep.
It's okay.
If it comes back to you.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's,
right, and I'm not trying to limit anybody's, I just want the formats to continue as we've had it.
One last comment, I guess, or a question. Yeah, there is the potential, based off the analysis that Matt Stark put together, that essentially says care homes essentially could be charged at a rate of 6.34 ESE. So even using your methodology, if we were going to be doing it based off of the actual costs that are associated with that zone type or land use type, you could potentially be even higher.
And to that, I would respond by indicating, there are only a limited number of properties in each of these categories. So we have this specifically, and you can see. So 1061 Cecilia Drive, which is Cecilia Place, has versus this 85, my data, more plus 76. The numbers overall in that third category, because it's just those handful of properties that have very different actual EMS costs, that if you were to lump us together, that would push ours higher. But that's for that very reason, and when you can see that data to say, well, we have 85 calls, 1199 Cecilia Drive has 135 calls, 700 Plymouth has 249 calls. Is it fair to lump us all together in terms of coming up with a value for that category? It's only 4 properties. You could easily break it out individually to account for the fact that there are very different EMS usage among those 4
Does it become at what point does it become a marketing ploy then for these facilities to start saying that we have a lower EMS charge than the facility down the street? You know, it's,
They might not the next year.
well, that's just it, you know, it's one of those where, I mean, it's always going to be a potential at a variable. And when it comes to fees, especially when it comes to elderly on fixed income, I don't like adding variableness to it.
You know, I think we could always say what if, or what if,
True.
use it for marketing or all that. We don't know any of that. We don't have any of that information. Could it possibly? I don't know. But imagine again how it would affect if Hawthorne or one of these other properties that has a lower charge says, hey, come to us, don't go to Cecilia Place, that could work against us. So-
Right, and that's when it starts getting into we're affecting businesses.
You have that right now. You have that atmosphere.
No, because it would be basically the same across the board in the care home world.
So I'm just going to interject again. If there's specific information that you would like from the appellants,
I already
in the
forgot
form
what
of
you
a
said.
question.
I don't know if this is productive anymore.
Yeah.
So, I mean, at that point, I'll frame it this way. So unless there's anything you would like to present further, unless there's any further questions specifically from the board, I think we've reached kind of that call and response. I think the information, the record is complete unless you feel differently at this point.
No, I think just in summary, our position is that you have to look at the actual data. Because again, that's how the report started, the methodology was saying, we're gonna look at the actual costs, we're gonna divide by the total number of calls, we're gonna apply that percentage to the cost, and that's what we're gonna impose against the property. I think that methodology broke down when it was lumped in on a category basis and occurred in the allocation. So I think to keep along that methodology, we should use the actual data, which by my calculation would come up with an adjusted fire and EMS charge of $51,993, with the other point being, again, exact same usage as Hawthorne Place. I'm not sure how we can say it is fair and even less fair and reasonable or equitable to reduce them to one ESC and to not make an adjustment for our property. So we would request a similar adjustment.
Thank you.
So,
Any,
at this point, we either have an action or not.
so at this point, thank you, Ms. Summers. The appellant having made their presentation, the village staff having made their presentation both at this hearing and at the original hearing, I think the board's request to close the last hearing was receipt of additional information. That's been provided here. So between the two hearings, I think the fact-finding portion of this is complete. The record is closed as to the evidence you can consider. So at this point, what we're looking for is action on this in the form of a motion. The options at this point with the record closed would be a motion to affirm the assessment of the fire and EMS fee, or if you're so inclined, a motion to accept or grant the applicant's appeal. And if that is the case, and the board's determination noting specifically any amounts to be refunded under the fire EMS fee. With either motion, what we would ask, consistent with the action that was taken with Hawthorne Place, is whatever motion is going to be made, the board needs to make specific citations to items that have been received, information that's been received into the record as evidence as the basis for that determination, so that we can then prepare a written determination to provide to the applicant. So,
Can I ask a clarification on
yes.
the ordinances as it's written? So her what she's presenting here is a change of our calculation.
Correct.
So that's outside of our ordinance?
Yep, so
correct?
for the-
Is the appeal really meant to be that we haven't applied our ordinance
Correct.
correctly?
So
Like
for the board's edification, I'm
Okay.
going to read exactly chapter and verse from our ordinance. The board shall determine whether the number of ESCs assigned is fair and reasonable in accordance with the terms of this ordinance and in the event an appeal is granted, whether or not a refund is due the appellant and the amount of that refund. So the standard is fair and reasonable in accordance with the terms of this ordinance. So you're correct in the sense that this ordinance was prepared and enacted based on a methodology already prepared by Baker Tilly. I think what the applicant, and not to put words in her mouth, what she has done is try to make an argument based on fair and reasonable by showing you some alternative methodologies here. So to the extent that your question is her methodology not what's in our ordinance? Yes, that's outside of what has already been approved and what this ordinance is based on. I mean, I think at this point, I think the record is closed, but although I did make a statement as to not putting words in your mouth, so I do not want to, if you have something that you would like to clarify, please do so.
Recall, one of the requests was to treat us the same as Hawthorne Place and give us the one ESC. So that would be within the terms of the ordinance and using the classification of the ordinance.
But do we have them specifically classified in the ordinance?
Yes, so if you'll recall, the relief that was given to another appellant was a reclassification of that property to a different definition within our ordinance, which allows for a lower ESC.
And that was related to Hawthorne Place's position as a 55-plus community in marketing language only.
So, I mean, that's not before the board here, but that is something to consider. The rationale for any sort of motion here has to be based on evidence that is in the record with this specific appellant.
So we do not have the ability to stray outside of a multiplication of ESE or reclassification.
I would say not. The standard is fair and reasonable in accordance with the terms of the ordinance. There's nothing in the ordinance that allows for different ESC determinations other than what's set forth in our code.
I'd like to make a motion that the fees assessed to 2061 Cecilia Drive are fair and reasonable by the current terms of the ordinance.
Are there any specific factors that you would like to include in that motion?
It's based on the terms of the actual ordinance and the way that it's written right now.
Anything in the record as with respect to this specific appellant that you believe it's being applied fairly and reasonably to this applicant?
Because it's a care home.
And what specifically in the evidence that you saw makes this a
Well, when
care
you
home?
compare it to Hawthorne Place where it's senior living, I don't think that the two of those are the same type of property or business.
And why?
One is apartments for seniors that could, Hawthorne Place are apartments for seniors that could be,
They don't provide any care.
they don't provide any care. And Cecilia does.
So there's a motion, is there a second?
Second, Krasovich.
Could you repeat the motion? Ma'am.
The motion is to affirm the assessment as presented for 1061 Cecilia Drive, based upon the classification being fair and reasonable pursuant to the terms of our ordinance, based upon the factors in the record cited by Trustee Gergen as to this fitting the definition of a care home.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions or comments? All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion is hereby carried. Item 3 is adjournment.
Motion to adjourn?
Second, Kreiser.
Okay. Any questions or comments? All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed? We're hereby adjourned from this meeting. Would anybody like to do a 5?